This is my little sister, Sarah. Sarah loved licorice and all four-legged creatures. She could swim like a seal for hours and climb anything all the way to the top. Sarah joined our family when she was 11 months old. She was subject to racist bullying throughout her childhood, and she was sexually abused by a neighbor for years, and we didn't know. Later, when Sarah lived downtown, she was sometimes seen rollerblading through Vancouver's inner city. And some women have told me she saved their lives. When Sarah started running away at 13, when we realized she was selling sex, when her addiction to heroin and cocaine became apparent, when she ended up on Vancouver's troubled downtown east side, through all those years between 1983 and the end of all of it in 1998, I just wanted her to stop. I feared and hated everything about her world. I felt terrible pain and guilt that I couldn't get her to change, and rage and impotence that she refused to do the right thing. Then, on April 14th, 1998, Sarah disappeared. In August 2002, her DNA was found on serial murderer Robert Pickton's property. He's now serving a life sentence, convicted of second-degree murder in the deaths of 6 women. During interrogation, he implied that he only needed to kill one more woman to reach 50. After the years-long search of his property, the pre-trial, the trial, the public inquiry, I moved more deeply into my teaching and writing. When I learned that Sarah had been sexually abused, I wrote a novel for teens exploring the silence around abuse. Then something changed. I became aware of a movement. I became aware that across Canada and around the world, sex workers are speaking out for their rights, for decriminalization of sex work. And I found myself wanting to join them. Years ago, when I was tentative and frightened, just starting to speak and write on the subject, a woman said to me, "We need allies." That's what I want to be, an ally. One way to describe sex work is in terms of a spectrum, ranging from limited choice to full choice. No choice at all would be off the spectrum into the realm of slavery and trafficking. Sarah was at the limited choices end, working on the street. At the other end of the spectrum, some people are making a career out of their work. For those in between, about 70%, sex work is a job. Sometimes a good job, other times not so good. Sex workers in every position on this spectrum say that criminalizing sex work causes harm. Much of our struggle, much of the reason why society is still trying to regulate sex work out of existence, flows, I believe, from stigma. Stigma is variously defined as a mark of a disgrace or infamy, a stain or reproach, and a mark of shame. For a moment, right now, consider your own secrets, the shameful ones. Consider the things you do or have done, the things you think or have thought, the things you feel or have felt that you don't want anyone to know. Now, imagine those secrets exposed for everyone to see. I believe that as a society, we locate a goodly portion of our collective shame in prostitutes. And I use that word instead of sex worker because the word prostitute is loaded with shame and stigma. Sarah's writing shows that she judged herself for selling sex. She internalized our stigma. 18 months before Sarah died, I took her to see a gynecologist, preliminary to a surgical procedure. It just so happened that the office was a fancy one, and that day the waiting room was filled with affluent women. Sarah did her best to shut out her environs. She had a stack of lottery tickets that she filled out while we were waiting. Once we were in the appointment, the doctor wanted to examine Sarah, and she refused categorically. It turned out that society's stigma had shoved its way in ahead of us. And no matter how easygoing that doctor in his shining office wanted to be, he and Sarah could not crack through to a clean, trusting relationship between doctor and patient. My heart still squeezes tight when I think of it. Imagine having to ask for help with one of your secrets. Imagine, as you walk into the doctor's office or the police station, that everyone who sets eyes on you knows your secret and judges you. That will give you just a glimmer of what it's like for someone like my sister to ask for help. Soon after Sarah disappeared, I told a teacher I was subbing for that I might be called away because my sister was missing. That teacher leaned back in her chair, looked at me over her glasses, and asked a few pointed questions. Then, "What a stigma you live under," she said to me. I still remember my mix of shock and surprise. Stigma? The stigma under which we place sex workers affects all of us. We still judge women for how they dress. We shame girls and women by calling them whores. We haven't let go of the idea that if a woman acts like a prostitute, she deserves to be treated like one. Well, that begs the question, how does a prostitute deserve to be treated? Our answers are all around us. Think about how sex workers are portrayed in popular culture. They are extras, establishing the grittiness of scenes by being manhandled through police stations. They are diseased, amoral, peopling street corners in scanty clothes and high heels, leaning into car windows. To have a more significant role in a movie or a TV show, a sex worker must often be already dead. As for real sex workers, not much different. We see the stock images and we hear about the dead bodies. We imagine women selling their bodies on street corners to an amorphous mass of misogynistic men. No wonder we don't know who sex workers are. How does a prostitute deserve to be treated? Exactly like anyone else. Sex workers sell services, not body parts. And those services are multifaceted, including physical acts, yes, but also comfort, acceptance, conversation, counseling, simple touch. It's deeply demeaning and objectifying to suggest that sex workers are selling their bodies. It's also dangerous because when we buy a thing, we believe that we can do what we want with it. When we buy a service, we must respect the rules of the transaction and the person we transact with until that transaction is concluded. A client who hurts a sex worker is not within his rights. In fact, he isn't even a client. Consider, you make an appointment with someone to come check a leak in your basement. A man rings your bell. When you open the door, he pushes his way in, punches you, and takes your laptop and your purse. That man is not a plumber. He's a criminal. Similarly, any person who hurts a sex worker or refuses to abide by the rules of the transaction is not a client, but a criminal. When we conflate clients and criminals, we make it easier for the criminals to pass as clients to do harm. And we make it easier for us to see sex workers as victims because we are imagining non-consensual encounters instead of consensual ones. Another conflation error we make, another norm we accept without thinking, lies in our tendency to focus on how sex workers make themselves vulnerable to violence. What led them to it? As if they walked into it of their own accord, as if violence and murder were a normal part of sex work. Sarah's addiction, her sex work, her life on the downtown East Side, none of those is the cause of her death. A man decided to target women in her community. One by one, over a period of years, he did so. Despite the fact that he was known to have stabbed a woman in 1997, he was not arrested until February of 2002. A combination of that man's violence and society's inaction led to my sister's death. Sex workers should have the same rights and freedoms as anyone else. The laws against assault, rape, and murder should be just as robustly protective of sex workers as they are of people in any other group. At the moment, this is not the case. Around the world, as I said earlier, sex workers are organizing. Here's a sampling. In 1985, in Amsterdam, the first World Whores Congress established the World Charter of Prostitutes' Rights. In 2000, the International Union of Sex Workers formed in the United Kingdom. WANETHA is a sex workers' rights organization in Uganda, one of hundreds of similar organizations all over the world. In West Bengal, India, the DMSC is a collective of 65,000 sex workers. A recent conference in India attracted 3,000 sex workers daily. In 2003, the International Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers was founded. The red umbrella is an important symbol for sex workers' rights, used every year on that day, December 17th. In Canada, where a recent study showed that 70% of sex workers are satisfied with their work, dozens of sex work groups and hundreds of individuals are coming together from across the country. Allies are speaking out in support. Sex workers from every position on the spectrum are listening to and speaking to one another like never before. And in one small, faraway country, only one, sex workers have reached an important goal. New Zealand decriminalized sex work in 2003. Since then, they have not had one case of human trafficking. There has been no increase in the numbers of people entering sex work, and the quality of life for sex workers has risen dramatically overall. I've been attending community conversations with sex workers, organized by FIRST, a long-standing feminist alliance working for decriminalization. Here are a few highlights. Sex work is a caring profession, said a longtime Vancouver madam. I validate people every day, said a woman who is a trans dominatrix. I got into sex work 3 years ago as a client, said a 30-something woman in a glittering scarf. And I was so transformed by the experience that I decided I wanted to do that too. A man with an advanced degree in sciences told us about traveling to California to study sexological bodywork, which helps him help his clients. A trailer for the Australian documentary Scarlet Road introduced us to the story of a sex worker's journey with 2 clients with disability, both of them people who otherwise had no opportunity for sexual expression and all the healing it can bring. The people in these examples are all from the more privileged end of the spectrum. Sarah was at the other end, as I've said. She did develop ongoing relationships with several clients. She was part of a community she cared about and that cared about her. She was also beaten and raped, and in the end, she was murdered. When I hear experienced sex workers speak so openly and with such ease about the meaning and value in their work, I weep. It's their courage that brings me to tears. In a world where only one country has decriminalized sex work, millions of people must hide parts of themselves and work in secret to avoid arrest, incarceration, and society's judgment. In this same world, predators pass as clients and prey on sex workers. We must stop forcing sex workers into the shadows. What can you do? Each year, on December 17th, in dozens of cities all over the world, sex workers and allies gather to mark the International Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers. Grab a red umbrella and come on out. Stand with sex workers as allies. Share the New Zealand example and spread this 2-part message. We must end the stigma and we must decriminalize sex work. Thank you.